Hey guys, tonight, we journey back to a time when darkness wasn't just an aesthetic, when it was an actual physical danger. You're walking along a narrow dirt path just outside a medieval village. It's late. The air is damp, the moon is somewhere behind a mess of clouds, and your only light is the sputtering flame of a stubby tallow candle half melted in your hand. You're wrapped in a woolen cloak that smells faintly of smoke and sheep. You've just left a cousin's cottage on some errand or another, hard to remember exactly, now that every snap of a twig behind you sounds like it has teeth. You pause. You listen. Was that a step or just your imagination? You hurry up anyway, because in the Middle Ages, murder wasn't a mystery novel or a rare urban headline. It was a very real, very likely possibility, something that made even the quietest night feel alive with dread. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your candle flickers, and just for a moment the wind dies. It's quiet. Too quiet. That's the moment when every medieval mind turned toward one thought: murder. Or rather, murder, the old Norman French term that seeped into English law, dragging with it all the baggage of secrecy, sin, and violent death. In that world, fear wasn't reserved for war or pestilence alone. It clung just as tightly to the idea of a sudden end, not on a battlefield, but at the hands of someone who waited for you in silence, who held a knife in the dark. In medieval Europe, murder wasn't an event. It was a threat, a presence, something that haunted the landscape. And it wasn't just a matter of dying. It was how you died and when. Dying without confession, without absolution, meant your soul might wander stuck in some purgatorial limbo. That's why sudden violent death was so much more than a tragedy. It was a spiritual emergency. And yet for all the fear, there were no police, no detectives, no yellow tape or sirens. Justice was an improvised performance, cobbled together from village gossip, hasty juries, and the hope that God would somehow nudge the truth into daylight. That's why even the most law-abiding folk carried knives, and sometimes a bit of rope. Not necessarily to commit murder, but to survive it. Picture yourself inside a one-room cottage huddled with your family. You've barred the wooden door, shoved the bench across it, and banked the hearth so the light doesn't spill outside. It's quiet except for the creak of the rafters. Someone's walking down the road, slow and deliberate. Not a cart, not a horse, just boots on dirt. You don't move. You barely breathe. Because even if it's just a neighbor, what if it's not? There were stories, always stories. A man stabbed while relieving himself in a field. A merchant strangled just outside the walls of Norwich. A boy found dead near the abbey, his purse missing, his prayers unsaid. Sometimes there were suspects. Sometimes there were trials. But often nothing came of it. Murderers disappeared into the woods, into another town, into a different name. Historians still argue whether medieval murder was actually more common than it is today, or just more visible. Records show that in 14th century Oxford, the murder rate was roughly 60 times higher than in modern London. But others point out that medieval record-keeping was patchy at best. What is clear is that people feared it, not abstractly, but bodily, breathlessly, every time a loved one was late returning home. And the murderers, they weren't faceless monsters. Often they were known. Quarrels turned deadly over grazing rights or spilled ale. Envy could draw a blade just as fast as war. In a world where justice was local and memory-long vendettas could simmer for years before boiling over. And when the blow finally came, it wasn't always in daylight. You pass under a low tree branch. Your candle gutters out. Suddenly you are swallowed by dark. You fumble for your flint. Your heart pounds in your ears. And now in that moment of helplessness, you realize why people told their children not to walk alone. Why mothers whispered prayers as their sons set out for market. Why monasteries locked their gates at sundown. Because somewhere out there, whether imagined or real, a knife waits in the dark. The road bends and you finally spot the flicker of a distant lantern. Relief washes over you, but it's cautious because you know better than to assume you're safe. Even within village walls, the threat of murder never really goes away. The night watchman might be asleep. The reeve might be bribed. The man walking just ahead of you might smile, nod, and still be carrying something sharp in his sleeve. In the Middle Ages, there were few places where one could feel truly secure, and even those were not immune to violence. Churches you'd think would be sanctuaries, and yes, in theory they were. The law even granted accused criminals the right to flee to the nearest church and claim sanctuary for up to 40 days. But sanctity didn't stop blood from spilling on holy floors. Priests were murdered, monks killed each other, and every now and then even God's house echoed with the sound of a dying man's final breath. You might be lying in bed in a castle, a tavern, or your own little home and still not be safe. Curtains drawn, shutters barred, you roll over and hope the door latch holds. Because there were cases, true cases of people murdered while they slept. A jealous brother, a debt unpaid, a political enemy, sometimes a hired killer, sometimes someone with a personal grudge and an opportunity. One notorious case took place in 1382 when a man named John of Swerford was found murdered in his own home in Oxfordshire. No signs of forced entry. The killer was never caught. People whispered about sorcery, betrayal, even a demon, but the likeliest suspect was his own servant. That possibility made things worse. If you couldn't trust the people under your own roof, where could you possibly hide? It wasn't just strangers who murdered. Family did. Friends did. Lovers did. Historians still argue whether these cases were sensational exceptions or just the ones that got written down. But the fear they caused was very real. Think about the medieval mindset. Loyalty was everything. Kinship was your social currency. And yet, betrayal could and did strike closest to home. Even the highest in society weren't safe. Castles had murder holes, sure, those charming little architectural features designed to pour boiling oil on invaders. But the true danger often came from inside the keep. Poisoned cups, daggers behind tapestries, trusted advisors with flexible morals. There's something uniquely terrifying about dying in your own bed, not from illness, but from someone else's ambition. Let's pause a moment and think about those who lived near the bottom of society. The servants, the serfs, the traveling beggars. If murder was a fear for the wealthy, it was a constant threat for the poor. No doors to lock, no bodyguards, no legal recourse. If someone hated you, or worse, wanted what little you had, they didn't need much to take it. A rock would do, a rusted blade, a sharp stick, and the element of surprise. And sometimes, just sometimes, you'd be blamed for someone else's crime. Maybe you fit the description. Maybe you were found near the scene. Maybe someone just didn't like your face. In a village, reputations were everything. And once yours soured, people started seeing you differently. Even if you were innocent. Especially if you were quiet. The law wasn't always on your side. In fact, it usually wasn't. If someone accused you of murder and you had no witnesses or alibi, it could come down to your word against theirs. And if they had status, well, good luck. The law was less blind and more nearsighted, squinting hard at whoever had the heavier purse. There was even a form of trial that involved duels, trial by combat, where two people would literally fight to the death to determine guilt. Logic none. But it made for quite a show. And medieval people loved a show, especially when it involved justice or something that looked like it. This is the world you inhabit now, a world where even the supposed safety of a locked room, a prayer-filled chapel, or a familial embrace doesn't guarantee your survival. Every creaking floorboard might be followed by a soft step. Every argument might turn into a fatal shove. Every warm bed might be the last place you ever see. And that's not paranoia, it's preparedness. So tonight, as you settle in, think like a medieval villager. You double-check the latch. You keep your knife within reach. You murmur a prayer not for sleep, but for survival. And if you hear something outside your window, you don't look, you don't move, you listen, and you wait for the dark to pass. The footsteps you feared turn out to be just a cow wandering loose from the nearby pasture bell clinking gently in the night. You breathe a little easier, but your heart's still racing. That's the trouble with fear in this world. It doesn't need proof. Just possibility. You're close to home now. The thatched roofs come into view, and smoke from dying hearths curls lazily into the air. The village is asleep, or at least pretending to be. In a place like this, everyone has heard a story or lived one. There's no shortage of tales about murder, and no one wants to be the next tale told. Every village has its shadow. A man who was killed over a field boundary. A wife found dead in the stream, accidentally drowned. A stranger seen once, then never again after a loud argument at the inn. These stories get told by candlelight, passed from generation to generation, like recipes or family curses. And behind everyone is a real name, a real place, a real fear. Let's imagine one of these stories now. It's a summer evening in 1315. You're at the village alehouse sharing a wooden bench with two other laborers. The man across from you, Osric, drinks too fast and talks too loud. He owes money, he's bitter about a failed harvest, and according to him, he's got nothing left to lose. He gets into it with the reeve, something about sheep, or maybe it's a fence. Words are exchanged, then threats. Osric storms out, and someone laughs behind him. But when the reeve is found dead the next morning, skull cracked and head in the ditch, the laughter fades. Now comes the part where the whole village becomes the courtroom. There's no constable to call, no magistrate with a robe and gavel. The hue and cry goes up. Neighbors gather. Osric, still nursing a hangover, is found sleeping in a hayloft with dried blood on his sleeve. He insists it's from a nosebleed. And maybe it is. But the jury isn't 12 strangers in black suits, it's your neighbors. The blacksmith, the baker, the priest's half-deaf brother. They know Osric. Some like him, some don't. The case will be decided as much by reputation as by evidence. Historians still argue whether this village-based justice was more communal or more dangerous. On one hand, it kept power close to home. On the other, it blurred the lines between justice and revenge. Osric may have done it, but if he didn't, tough luck. The reeve was well-liked. Osric was not. Murder investigations, such as they were, followed curious logic. A common method involved touching the corpse. It was believed that a murderer's presence could make the wounds bleed again. This cruentation, as it was later called, was considered perfectly valid evidence. No one stopped to ask the corpse for comment. But let's say Osric gets off, someone else confesses, or the reeve turns up alive, drunk, and in the wrong village. The fear doesn't go away. In fact, it lingers longer. Because now no one knows who's guilty, and no one likes not knowing. So the gossip begins. Theories multiply. That old woman who talks to her cat too much. Suspicious. The miller who works alone at night. Eccentric. You were seen walking home late near the ditch. Maybe you know more than you're saying. That's the thing about fear, it's contagious. It spreads faster than facts, and once it takes root, it doesn't need logic to grow. And so people start to watch each other a little more closely. Doors stay bolted longer. Eyes linger on strangers. Trust once broken doesn't patch easily. In this village and 100 like it, murder isn't just a crime, it's a social rupture. It upends routines, poisons friendships, and leaves a scent that takes years to fade. Even children start to play games about it. Hide from the killer, they chant as they scatter into the twilight. And no one laughs too hard. As you finally reach your door, you think again of Osric. You think of the Reeve. You think of all the things you've heard, and all the things you haven't. You reach for the latch, glancing once more at the street behind you. Empty. But that doesn't mean safe. Because the real moment of fear isn't when the blade strikes. It's the second before. When you hear the step, the breath, the nothingness. That's the moment medieval people feared most. The latch lifts with a soft creak, and you step inside, grateful for the familiar smell of wood smoke and boiled grain. The fire has settled into glowing embers, the kind that make everything feel softer, less menacing. But the unease doesn't fade. It lingers like damp in the corners, like something watching just beyond the shutters. You close the door behind you. You draw the bolt. It's just a loop of wood and iron, but in a world without keys, it's the best you've got. Then you do what any reasonable person in the Middle Ages would do after a disturbing evening. You lie to yourself. You say it was just an animal, just the wind, just shadows. But in your mind, you hear it again. What if it wasn't? And if it wasn't, what would you do? Let's say you saw someone murdered. Not in a story, not as a whispered rumor, but with your own eyes. Someone struck down in the road. Maybe it was your friend. Maybe it was someone you didn't know. Either way, now the weight of justice rests on your shoulders, because in the medieval world, if you saw a murder, you were required to act. This is the system known as hue and cry. You don't get to be a bystander. You're expected by law no less to raise your voice, chase the killer, and summon the whole village into action. You cry murder or thief or help and hope your neighbors aren't too sleepy or too scared to follow. Sound exhausting. It was. But it was also one of the only ways to catch a killer in a world without police. If you didn't shout, you could be fined. If the village didn't respond, they could be fined. Collective justice. Crowd-sourced vengeance, but also mass hysteria when it went wrong. Imagine this: you wake to the sound of a bell clanging, someone pounding on your door, hue and cry. A man's been stabbed near the smithy. You throw on your cloak, grab a lantern, and stumble out with a handful of other villagers, bleary-eyed and half barefoot. The attacker but someone thinks they saw a figure in a brown cloak running toward the woods. You all sprint after the shadow, breathing hard, hearts pounding. Someone trips, someone swears. You lose the trail, but the adrenaline keeps you charging through the brambles for another hour. And when you return, scratched and sweating, there's nothing to show for it but fear and splinters. But that fear is valuable. It binds the village. Keeps people watching each other. It's a weird kind of social glue stitched with suspicion. The hue and cry wasn't always about catching the killer. Sometimes it was about proving you weren't the killer. If you were seen helping with the chase, you couldn't be blamed for the crime, at least not easily. If you stayed in bed, well, people noticed. Historians still argue whether the hue and cry was effective. Some say it was primitive but functional. Others call it performative panic, like chasing ghosts with torches. But it served a purpose. It turned every murder into a community affair. No one got to look away. And once the body was found, things got even weirder. The local coroner, often a priest or reeve, would be summoned. The body was examined, the position of the limbs, noted any nearby weapons recorded. Then came the village jury, a dozen or so men from the area summoned to decide what happened. There was no training, no standard procedure, just experience, reputation, and sometimes superstition. They might ask, was the corpse warm when you found it? Did the wounds look fresh? Did the accused have a grudge? They might also ask if the corpse bled when the accused approached. Because yes, that was genuinely believed to be a sign of guilt. Let's say they suspect someone. He's known to carry a knife. He and the victim argued last week about a stolen chicken. There are no witnesses, but he's poor, unpopular, and smells like onions. That might be enough. You being a modern thinker might find this ridiculous. But in the 14th century, this was justice. And it was frightening not just because of what happened to the dead, but what might happen to the living. A false accusation, a mistaken identity, a town too eager to punish. In such a system, being too quiet was suspicious. Being too loud was worse. You had to be just the right amount of helpful, just the right shade of ordinary. So as you sit now in your cottage wrapped in a scratchy blanket, you think about what you'd do if you heard that call. Would you rush into the dark, chasing someone you've never seen? Would you accuse a neighbor to save your own skin? Would you speak up or stay silent? The truth is you don't know, and neither did anyone else. That's the terrible beauty of the hue and cry. It wasn't just about catching a murderer. It was about choosing who you became when fear came knocking. You're still awake. Sleep won't come easy tonight, not after all that. The wind has picked up, rattling the shutter like bony fingers testing the latch. The fire's all but out, just a faint orange glow. You shift under the wool blanket and stare into the dark, and you think, what if someone in this very village has done it? Committed the one act that unravels everything. Because in medieval society, murder wasn't a private affair. It was a public unraveling. A breach not just of law or morality, but of community. It didn't just kill a person. It unsettled the balance of everything. Your fields, your friendships, your church pews. You probably know someone who was there when the body was found. Maybe it was near the well, or in a pigsty, or in a forest clearing, where lovers usually meet. Someone found it, shouted, gathered others, and then the whole village held its breath. Because from that moment on, everyone was part of it. A murder sparked a village drama, not a police investigation, but a living rumor mill. The baker says the victim owed money to the thatcher. The blacksmith saw someone with a bruised hand. The priest hears a confession that's suspiciously vague. Every conversation turns to theories. Every stare lingers a little longer. And there's the jury. The jury of presentment, as it was known, didn't consist of experts. It was local men, often 12, who gave sworn testimony about crimes in their community. Some were eager. Some were terrified. All of them knew that if they got it wrong, a murderer might walk free, or worse, an innocent man might hang. Either way, it would be remembered. For decades, possibly centuries. You might have to testify, and not in a court, mind you, in a barn, or in the church nave, or standing in the field where the body was found, with a handful of nervous villagers and a coroner with ink-stained fingers. The coroner's job to record, to list the facts or what people said were facts, to measure the distance between the wound and the road, or guess the weight of a rock found nearby. In some cases, the murder weapon was obvious. In others, it was missing, presumed buried, thrown in a stream, or eaten by pigs. Yes, really. Historians still debate how reliable these community investigations were. On the one hand, locals knew everyone. They could spot a lie or a guilty twitch. On the other hand, bias was baked in. Feuds, grudges, rivalries, these things didn't vanish just because someone died. Sometimes they got worse. You wonder what it would feel like to be accused. Maybe you weren't home the night it happened. Maybe someone saw your cloak near the woods. Maybe you're just a little too quiet. You say you're innocent. But what if that isn't enough? There are no defense lawyers, no fingerprints, no surveillance tapes, just your word and maybe your neighbors. It all sounds terrifying. And it was. But here's the strange thing, sometimes it worked. A guilty man confessed. A witness remembered something crucial. A murder was solved. Justice of a sort was done. But even when it wasn't, the process gave people a way to move forward. It gave the illusion of control in a chaotic world. After all, medieval life was constantly on the edge: war, plague, famine. Murder was just another reminder that death could come quickly from a blade or a bowl of bad stew. But fear needed somewhere to go, and so it went into process, into ritual, into gathering and pointing fingers and deciding who could stay and who had to hang. The result was a system that wasn't fair by modern standards, but it was familiar. It belonged to the people. That made it feel just enough. You close your eyes. You imagine the village gathered again, a few benches dragged together, the reeve clearing his throat, a name read aloud, murmurs in the crowd. The accused steps forward, pale, tired, hands trembling. And in that moment, truth doesn't matter as much as believability. If they believe you did it, you did it. And if they don't, well, you still might want to leave town. You wake early just as the gray-blue light begins to spill across the floorboards. The village is stirring, but not loudly. The kind of quiet that comes after something unsettling. After a death. After a reckoning. You pull your cloak around your shoulders and step outside. The air is damp and heavy. Someone's burning damp straw nearby, and the smoke curls low to the ground. You can hear distant murmuring near the chapel. People gathering again. The aftermath of a murder isn't just talk, it's ritual. It's fear management. Because in the medieval mind, a sudden violent death wasn't just dangerous, it was damning. You walk down the lane past the weaver's cottage, the broken cart by the blacksmith's, and pause at the little shrine near the edge of town. Someone's left a bit of bread there. A charm, perhaps. Or a bribe for whatever spirits might be watching. After all, the real terror of murder wasn't always the act, it was what it interrupted. If you died without last rites, without confession, without absolution, your soul was in danger. Not just danger of being mourned improperly, but of being eternally lost. That's why murder was more than physical, it was spiritual violence. It robbed you not only of life, but of salvation. Imagine being the mother of a young man found stabbed in the woods. No time for a priest. No final words. His soul, some believed, might wander restless and unfinished, stuck between this life and the next. Medieval people had a name for such souls, the unshriven dead. Spirits who hadn't been properly prepared for death. And so they became legends. Ghosts. Warnings. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were widespread or more local, but there's no doubt they were potent. Entire communities were shaken not just by murder, but by the religious consequences it carried. A clean death was a good death, a holy death. A murder was something else entirely, something unclean. In many cases, the dead were honored with prayers, processions, bells, and requiems, whether or not their killer had been caught. But for some, the fear was that even all that might not be enough. If someone died with a grudge or in mortal sin or on cursed ground, there were stories, grim ones, of the dead returning. Not for revenge exactly, but for completion. You make your way to the chapel where the coroner's cart has arrived. The body lies wrapped in linen, a stain already darkening the cloth. People avert their eyes. No one wants to look directly. You hear a whisper, "He never confessed," and feel a chill that has nothing to do with the breeze. This death will linger, not just in law but in memory. It will mark the village in ways you can't quite articulate. Some people will grow quiet, others will grow loud. Some will pray more or drink more or both, and the rituals will repeat. You remember the warning bells tolling last night, deep, resonant, mournful. They weren't just to announce death. They were meant to scare away evil, to tell the village and maybe the devil that a soul was passing, that we knew, that we saw, that we hadn't looked away. And the church would speak of sin, of repentance, of the fragile line between heaven and hell. Sermons would swell with references to Cain and Abel, to blood crying from the ground, to the need for justice, not just for the body, but for the soul. That's why in the medieval world murder terrified on two levels. One, because it could happen to anyone, and two, because it might ruin you in ways even death couldn't fix. You walk back from the chapel slowly thinking about that. The balance between justice and mercy. The fear that your own death might not come gently. And the quiet hope that anyone would help you across the boundary when the time came. Because that's the thing about medieval life, you feared murder, yes. But you feared unholy death even more. And you still don't know which one would find you first. The day trudges onward, but the shadow of last night's death doesn't lift. It clings to the village like chimney soot. People speak in half sentences and sideways glances, and yet life doesn't stop. Bread still needs baking, sheep need herding, gossip needs retelling. You pass a pair of women kneading dough on a wooden table outside. They talk quietly, but you catch the name Becket. Not Osric, not the Reeve Becket. And that means they're reaching further back now, drawing comfort or drama from a murder that shook the world, not just a village. Because sometimes when murder hits close to home, people retell the famous ones. The ones everyone knows. The ones that changed history. Like the death of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was hacked to death in his own cathedral in 1170. A place as holy as it gets. A place where blood was never supposed to fall. Becket's murder wasn't some tavern brawl. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a political hit job whispered into motion by none other than King Henry II. At least that's the version people like to tell. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" the king supposedly muttered one evening, after Becket yet again defied his authority. 4 knights, ever eager to impress, took the hint. They rode to Canterbury and burst into the cathedral, swords drawn. Becket was in prayer. They demanded he submit. He refused. They struck. His skull was cleaved in multiple places. His brains spilled on the stone floor near the altar. Monks wailed. Blood pooled. A holy man lay dead in a holy place, and the world gasped. Word spread like wildfire. Within days, people called him a martyr. Within weeks, they said miracles occurred at his tomb. And within 3 years, he was canonized St. Thomas Becket. Historians still argue over Henry's intent. Did the king really mean for Becket to die? Or was it a careless comment twisted into action by zealous knights? We may never know. But the murder itself was a thunderclap in medieval Europe, and the fallout epic. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury. The shrine became one of the most sacred in Christendom. The king, terrified of excommunication, and a revolt, walked barefoot through the streets, let monks whip him in penance, and wept at the tomb. Now that's a PR crisis. You might wonder, why did this story matter to villagers like you? Why did your neighbors talk about Becket like they'd known him personally? Because it wasn't just about Becket. It was about the idea that murder could unmake order itself. When a king's men killed a priest, the whole hierarchy trembled. If sanctity wasn't safe, what was? If blood could stain an altar, then where could you stand that was truly beyond reach? And also, let's be honest, People love a good martyr story, especially one with drama, betrayal, and poetic justice. You've seen Beckett's image, his face in stained glass, a little wooden charm worn around someone's neck, a name carved into chapel walls. He's become more than a man. He's a symbol of what happens when worldly power meets divine resistance and tries to win with a sword. And in villages like yours, Beckett's death was more than a tale of kings and bishops. It was a mirror held up to every petty feud, every reckless word, every act of violence that spiraled into something no one could take back. You pause on your walk. The fields stretch golden and wide. Birds flit overhead. Somewhere nearby, someone is singing softly. Life goes on even after blood has been spilled. But the memory lingers. Because once upon a time, a man was murdered for doing what he believed was right. And the men who killed him thought they'd be praised. They weren't. You turn toward the path home, the smell of earth and distant smoke in your nose. And you think not for the first time that the most dangerous murders aren't the ones done in anger. They're the ones done in obedience. As the sun dips low and the sky takes on that iron-gray hue of coming twilight, you walk home slower than usual. Not because you're tired, but because your thoughts are heavier now. The story of Becket still clings to you like mist, sacred blood on sacred stone, the wrath of kings, the quiet fury of the church. But Becket wasn't the only noble victim, not the only one whose death rang out through the centuries like a bell. Because then there's Edward, King Edward, the second of his name and his death. Well, let's just say people are still talking about it. Edward II's reign was messy, politically, militarily, and well, romantically. He had enemies even in his own family, especially in his own family. His nobles despised him. His wife loathed him. His favorites, most notably Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, were the subject of endless scandal gossip and not-so-subtle threats of rebellion. Eventually, those threats stopped being subtle. In 1327, Edward was forced to abdicate by a coup led by Queen Isabella, yes, his wife and her ally and rumored lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and shortly afterward, he died. But here's the catch: we don't know how. Or rather, we have too many ideas. The most infamous story, whispered by monks and scribbled in the margins of manuscripts, says Edward was murdered with a red-hot poker. Yes, that kind of poker, inserted in a way that left no visible wounds, a horrifying theatrical death, and one supposedly designed to humiliate him beyond the grave. It's gruesome, yes, but also deeply symbolic. Historians still argue whether it actually happened. Some say it was invented decades later as propaganda. Others suggest Edward escaped and lived in secret, a royal ghost hiding in the Alps. A few even claim to have found documents supporting this. But what's undeniable is the power of the murder myth. Because if true, it wasn't just murder. It was regicide, the killing of a king. And in medieval Europe, that was the ultimate disruption. Kings were anointed with holy oil. They weren't just rulers, they were sacred figures. To kill one wasn't just a crime against the crown, it was a sin against the divine order. And yet Edward's death didn't spark a crusade of vengeance. People were relieved, a little shocked maybe, but not outraged, which tells you something. Sometimes fear doesn't come from the act, it comes from the silence that follows. You pass by a boy playing with a stick in the dirt, drawing crude pictures of knights and castles. He's humming to himself. You wonder if he knows about Edward, if he's heard the story of the poker, or if he only knows that kings can die too. Because that's what Edward's story does. It reminds people that no one is untouchable, that even the man who wore the crown can be brought down smothered in his cell or burned from the inside. And it changes how people see power. If a queen can plot her husband's downfall, if nobles can turn prison into execution, if the church can bless one king and bury another in secrecy, well, then what's to stop it from happening again? You reach your door. The sky is darker now, flecked with stars. Somewhere behind you, the chapel bell tolls once a reminder that night has arrived. Edward's death, no matter how it happened, became a story that lived. A cautionary tale whispered in courts, dramatized in plays, and retold by traveling singers looking for a few extra coins. Even now you can picture it. A cold stone room, the flicker of torchlight, the clink of chainmail, and a man once king realizing that this is how it ends. No army, no glory, no final speech, just the sound of boots and the promise of pain. You sit on your bed and pull the blanket up, but not all the way. Part of you still listens for footsteps, for hushed voices outside the window. Because kings weren't safe, saints weren't safe. So what chance do you have? The wind has picked up again, and you lie awake listening to the old thatch roof groan under its weight. You think of the poker, of Beckett's blood on the altar, of the reeve in the ditch. You tell yourself it's just stories, just echoes from other lives. But deep down, you know better. In a medieval village like yours, murder isn't just an idea, it's a job you might be drafted into. Because if someone is killed and the hue and cry goes up, you are legally required to chase the killer. Not volunteer, not consider it, not form a committee about it next week. You run, you shout, you gather others. If you don't, if you stay in bed, claim a headache, pretend you didn't hear anything, you could be fined, or worse, suspected of helping the killer escape. This wasn't a side quest for brave adventurers. This was medieval civic duty, a world where everyone from the shepherd to the tavern keeper was conscripted into community justice. And whether you were ready or not, your legs better be. Picture it, you're pulling your boots on with shaking hands, fumbling for your cloak as someone outside is ringing the church bell frantically. A boy bangs on your door. They killed Walter the Miller. He shouts, eyes wide, breath fogging in the cold. You don't ask how, you don't ask why. You just grab your lantern, your walking stick, and follow the crowd into the night. The first few minutes are chaos. People yelling, someone tripping in the mud, a dog barking as if it knows more than the rest of you. Someone points toward the woods. You all go that way. No real plan. Just boots on frozen grass and adrenaline pumping through linen sleeves. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the hue and cry. Some argue it worked at least some of the time. Communities were small. Strangers stood out. A man in a bloodied cloak could hardly hide in a town of 80 people. But others suggest it was more of a ritual than a reliable method. A way to show that something was being done, even if nothing came of it. There were rules, too. Technically, you could pursue a killer across shire lines. You could rouse another town's inhabitants to join the chase. The law assumed you'd keep going until the killer was caught, or your feet gave out. It was the medieval equivalent of a manhunt minus maps, radios, or stamina. But what if you chased the wrong person? That happened. A lot. False accusations weren't uncommon, and a suspicious-looking traveler could find himself at the wrong end of a pointed stick simply for having poor timing or muddy boots. Sometimes the killer was clever. He changed clothes, disguised his face, blended in with the very mob looking for him. And sometimes, let's be honest, the killer was one of the ones doing the chasing. Nothing says not guilty quite like running after yourself with convincing outrage. You remember your neighbor Henry. Quiet man, bit odd, always out walking after dark. You've seen the way he sharpens his tools just a little too slowly. If someone turned up dead tomorrow, would you think of Henry? Would you say anything? That's the uncomfortable part of the hue and cry. It wasn't just a chase, it was a social performance. Your absence meant suspicion. Your enthusiasm meant innocence, or at least plausible deniability. And once the dust settled and the search failed and the sky began to pale with dawn, you all trudged home. Muddy, cold, uncertain. Because fear didn't end when the footsteps stopped. It lingered. There might be no resolution, no arrest. Just more rumors. A tavern slightly emptier. A window that stays shuttered longer. A name that no one says out loud anymore. And you, what have you learned maybe to be louder next time? Maybe to keep your cloak clean in case you need to look respectable. Maybe to suspect people you didn't before. Because in this world, the duty to catch a murderer could make one out of you. You drift to sleep. Eventually, shoes still damp from the night's pursuit. Dreams filled with running figures, dark woods, and the sound of your own voice yelling a name into the wind. You don't wake to birdsong. You wake to bells. Not the gentle chime of morning mass, but the slow, grim toll of a death bell. Someone has died. Again. And by now, you can't help but wonder, was it natural or was it another murder? As you sit up and rub your eyes, you hear footsteps outside. Whispers. People moving in a way that says they want to be seen, not looking like they're listening. And that always means they're listening very, very closely. You rise and walk toward the chapel. The crowd is smaller today, quieter. Some tragedies suck the air out of the community. Others stir it like a wasp's nest. Today feels like the latter. You edge close enough to catch a sentence. They say he was killed in the priory. You blink. In the priory. Because now we're not talking about fields or alleys or ditches. We're talking about a place of silence. A place of prayers. A place filled with men who took vows to do no harm. And yet sometimes the killer wore robes. The idea that monks could murder was unthinkable to many, uncomfortable to all. And yet it happened. Not often, but just enough to feed the kind of stories that never die. You know the priory. You've been there. You've seen the walled garden, the modest kitchen, the long stone corridors where the light always seems half extinguished. It's peaceful, but in a claustrophobic way. Like peace being pressed down by rules, silence, routine, and resentment. Historians still puzzle over just how common violence was in monastic settings. Most monks, of course, weren't killers, but they were human. And where there are humans, there are grudges, power struggles, pride, greed, lust, the usual list of sins. There's a record from 1319 of a monk in Yorkshire who was found strangled in his cell. Another from Normandy, where two brothers in Christ got into a deadly fight over stolen wine. And then there are the less clear cases, bodies found in the river, bruises hidden beneath habits, accidents that no one questions too loudly. It's not always murder exactly. Sometimes it's manslaughter. Sometimes it's covered up. Because who wants to accuse a man of God? Who wants to say that a holy place wasn't quite so holy? And yet the people whisper. You pass by the baker who leans close and mutters, "It was overland." The abbot tried to hide it. Another says they say it wasn't even a monk. It was the lay brother who tends the sheep. Someone else swears the victim was found face down in the cloister, hands folded like he'd knelt for prayer and never got up again. None of it is confirmed. All of it is believed. The priory is closed today. No one allowed in. But you've been inside before. You can imagine the shadows, the echoing footsteps, the stone floor where blood could pool and vanish into cracks long before anyone thought to ask what happened. In theory, monks were subject to church courts. In practice, they were often protected. The church liked to handle its own problems, discreetly. That meant if someone died under suspicious circumstances in a priory, the investigation might never leave the walls. And what happens when someone whispers too loudly? When a villager accuses a man of God, often the villager gets in more trouble than the monk. You pause and think about it. If a monk can kill, who can't? The whole purpose of religious life was to leave behind violence, to retreat from the world's chaos and cruelty. But when that violence followed you in, it became something even darker, something sacred gone sour. You head home with a strange feeling in your gut. Not fear, exactly. More like disorientation. Like someone pulled back the veil and showed you that the world is made of weaker stuff than you thought. Because if monks kill monks, if altars aren't safe, if prayer can't stop a dagger, then what's left? The next day is cooler with a breeze that carries the smell of wet earth and old hay. The kind of day that feels less like weather and more like a sigh from the land itself. You pass the chapel again, still closed. People avoid looking at it now. Too many thoughts in too tight a space. A few offer muttered prayers as they walk by. Others just keep walking. But the memory of death, especially a mysterious one, doesn't fade quickly. It lingers like wood smoke, curling into corners of conversation and dreams alike. You head toward the village green, where people have gathered not for celebration, but for a kind of trial. Not in a courtroom, but in a clearing. Because in this world, when there's no confession, no witnesses, and no clear answers, there's always one option left: God decides. Welcome to Trial by Ordeal. It's exactly as medieval as it sounds. The idea was simple. If humans couldn't determine guilt, they'd ask the divine to weigh in. And how do you do that? No, hot iron, boiling water, drowning, completely reasonable stuff. The man standing at the center of the crowd today is pale, sweating lips, moving in silent prayer. He's accused of killing his brother in a fight over inheritance. No one saw it. No one heard it. But he was the last to be seen with the victim, and that's enough to demand a test. He's chosen the hot iron ordeal. The priest approaches with a long iron rod already glowing from the coals. A hush falls. The rules are clear: he must carry the iron 3 paces. Then his hand is bound and left to heal for 3 days. If when unwrapped it's clean, he's innocent. If it's festering, guilty. You know what you're thinking. That's not how burns work. And you'd be right. But this wasn't about science. This was about faith and fear. The church officially banned trial by ordeal in 1215. But for generations afterward, communities still practiced it, especially in rural areas like yours. Old habits and all that. Historians still argue over how seriously these trials were taken. Some suggest the priests were quietly manipulating the outcome, only heating the iron slightly, or choosing clean water for those they thought innocent. Others believe people truly expected divine judgment to show itself through wounds and healing. What's terrifying is that everyone involved truly wanted answers. They just didn't have many tools for getting them. And here's where it gets even stranger. Sometimes it wasn't the accused who was tested. Sometimes it was the corpse. Yes, trial by corpse. One of the more peculiar beliefs of the time was that the body of a murder victim could identify its killer. The ritual went like this: the suspected murderer was brought to the corpse. If the wounds bled or the body twitched, it was taken as proof of guilt. This practice was called cruentation. You might laugh, or shudder, or both. But imagine being that accused person brought forward in front of the whole village, made to touch the still body of your friend, your cousin, your rival. Everyone watching. Everyone hoping for a twitch. Even if you were innocent, your hands would shake. Your breath would hitch. And if the corpse bled for any reason, well, people would remember that forever. Back at the trial, the man takes the iron. His hand trembles, but he walks. 1 step, 2, 3. He sets it down. The priest nods gravely and begins binding the hand in cloth and ointment. In 3 days, they'll unwrap it. And those 3 days, they'll be worse than the burn. Because now the whole village watches. Some believe he's guilty, others are unsure. You're undecided, but you'll find out soon enough. Or at least you'll be told the result. Whether you believe it, that's another matter. But in this world, belief is half the law, and the other half is fear. You walk home, fingers tingling from imagined heat, trying not to think about what it would feel like to carry hot iron in your own hand. You're not guilty of anything after all. Are you? But that's the thing about medieval justice. Sometimes the question isn't what you did. It's how much pain you're willing to endure to prove you didn't. The days pass, and the air thickens with anticipation. Every conversation circles back to the same thing, the burn, the hand, the answer. It's as if the entire village is holding its breath, waiting for the bandages to come off, not just to know the man's fate, but to confirm whether God is still paying attention. You're not immune to the tension either. You pass the man's cottage and glance at the shuttered windows, wondering what he's thinking. Wondering what you'd be thinking if it were your hand wrapped in linen, your name on everyone's tongue, your soul teetering between belief and infection. But just as you think the village can't take any more speculation, someone else starts talking, not about the man, but about the victim. She's been seen, a woman whispers, near the well, near the woods, just at the edge, before dawn. The others fall silent. No one laughs. Because in the medieval imagination, murder victims didn't always stay quiet. Sometimes they spoke from beyond the grave. It sounds impossible, of course. But remember, this was a world soaked in religion, mystery, and myth. Life and death weren't separate states. They overlapped, mingled, tugged at each other. And when someone died violently without justice, without confession, that line got even thinner. The belief in restless, dead ghosts, revenant spirits, was widespread across medieval Europe, especially when murder was involved. A soul cut loose by violence might return to demand retribution. Historians have uncovered reports from England, France, and Scandinavia about walking corpses, people who'd been buried, but were said to knock on doors, speak names, or even attack the living. Sometimes they came in dreams. Sometimes they appeared in fog, always with unfinished business. And these weren't always vague visions. Specific people were named. She saw him by the orchard, someone might say. He pointed at the miller's house. That kind of accusation carried weight. Fear has a way of bending ears toward whatever voice suits the moment. In one 12th century English chronicle, there's a tale of a man named William who was murdered on the road to Winchester. No one saw it happen. But the next week, a shepherd claimed to hear William's voice every night at dusk, calling for justice. Eventually, the killer confessed not to the authorities, but to a priest racked with fear from dreams he couldn't shake. Was it real? Who knows? But that's not the point. What matters is what people believed. Because when logic failed, when trials failed, when hot iron and boiling water didn't bring clarity, sometimes the dead stepped in. Or so it seemed. You reach the chapel just as the small crowd gathers again. Today's the day. The man's hand is unwrapped. The priest does it slowly, reverently, as though the cloth is holy. The crowd leans forward. You can feel the heat of their breath in the cool morning air. And then the hand is clean. No pus, no swelling, no sign of infection. A wave of murmurs ripples outward. Relief, frustration, doubt. He's innocent, officially, but not everyone agrees. Someone mutters, he healed too quickly. Another says, the priest likes his family. And then someone not young, not old, someone from the edge of the crowd says what everyone else is only thinking. She still walks at night. And just like that, the story shifts. It's no longer about him. It's about her, the victim, the wronged, the restless. You go home that night with your head full of questions. What if she does appear? Would you run, or would you listen? If a ghost asked you to avenge her, would you? You fall asleep listening for footsteps that aren't there. The wind taps the shutter like a knuckle. A shadow moves across the floor, but it's just the fire dimming. Still, you wonder. Maybe the dead don't come back for justice. Maybe they just want to be remembered. You wake to the scent of something cooking barley porridge, maybe with too much salt and not enough barley, but you're grateful for it. The ghosts of the last few days have left you a little hollow, and even bad food is grounding. Outside, the village moves more briskly. The dead are still dead, but the rituals have run their course, and now it's time to return to the living, or at least pretend to. You head to the market square, a space that usually smells like turnips and old wool, and today it also smells like cheese. A thin man in a cloak too fine for his face is setting up a low table. On it, wheels of cheese, 2 loaves of barley bread, and what looks suspiciously like a knife hidden under a cloth. This, oddly enough, is not lunch. It's a trial. Because in the strange logic of the medieval world, sometimes guilt was determined not with swords or prayers, but with a snack. You've stumbled into what's known as the korsnid, the trial by bread. Or more specifically, the ordeal of the morsel. It sounds like a joke. It isn't. The accused is brought forward. He swears his innocence. And then he is given a mouthful of dry bread and cheese blessed by a priest and told to chew and swallow. If he chokes, turns pale, or can't finish it, guilty. If he eats it calmly and lives to burp another day, innocent. It's absurd, you think. But then again, what's more honest than a body's reaction? This was the logic of the age. God could act through anything, even bread, especially bread. And the body was a stage upon which justice might briefly appear. The accused today is a merchant, caught near the body of a murdered tanner. Claims he was just passing through. Claims the tanner was already dead. No one believes him, but no one saw him do it either. So here we are. The merchant takes the bite. The crowd holds its breath. He chews, slowly. His face twitches. A crumb escapes, and then he coughs. Not a big cough. Just enough. He tries to smile. Tries to swallow again. But now he's sweating, and people are already shaking their heads. You glance at the priest. His expression doesn't change. It's decided. Guilty. You watch as the merchant is taken away, and you wonder how many lives have turned on a badly timed cough. How many innocent people have had dry mouths, bad luck, or a tiny bit of fear in the wrong moment. And how many guilty ones knew how to fake a calm chew. Historians still argue whether these trials were meant to find truth or simply to end argument. Some say the priest would watch for signs. Others believe the community's consensus mattered more than the result. But what's clear is that this ritual wasn't really about food. It was about fear, about watching someone under pressure, about seeing what guilt looks like. You walk away from the square feeling strange. Justice shouldn't taste like old cheese, but here it often does, and it's not the only strange method. You've heard of other things, divining with bones, interpreting dreams, reading the pattern of spilled grain on the floor. People were desperate for certainty, and in a world without science, they made do with symbolism. Maybe the gods really did speak through crumbs, or maybe people just needed a verdict, and bread was easier to argue with than a corpse. Back home, you nibble at your own crust, testing your throat out of superstition. It goes down fine. But that's not the point. The point is this: in the medieval world, guilt wasn't always proven by facts. Sometimes it was proven by lunch. The air smells sweeter today, clover damp grass, the lingering musk of sheep. You wander toward the edge of the village where the fences begin to blur into the open fields and the trees grow a little thicker. You're walking not to go anywhere, but to step away from everything. The bread trial, the talk of ghosts, the tension that still clings like cobwebs to every doorstep. But of course, even here, you can't escape the stories. You reach a small hill where an older man, barefoot, broad-nosed, and as wrinkled as a boiled apple, is telling tales to a group of children, all of them perched in the grass with wide eyes and muddy hands. He's talking about Iceland, not the real one you suspect. The one in the sagas, those long, winding stories full of honor sheep and sudden stabbings. Tales where people say things like, blood demands blood, and no one ever lets an insult slide. You sit on a rock nearby, pretending not to listen. But you're listening. Of course you are. Because in the Icelandic sagas, murder is never just murder. It's part of a cycle. A spark in a feud that may last generations. A legal drama wrapped in poetry where vengeance is expected and honor is heavier than a sword. Take Njal's saga, for example, one of the most famous. It's got all the classics. Property disputes, hot tempers, clever wives, and fire. Lots of fire. Men are burned alive in their homes. Reputations are ruined. Families are dragged into endless tit-for-tat killings. And all of it is governed by law. Sort of. Because medieval Iceland didn't have kings. No sheriffs, no formal army. Justice was handled by the Althing, the annual gathering of chieftains and farmers who debated legal codes and heard disputes. If someone killed your brother, you didn't call the guard. You gathered witnesses. You brought the case to the Althing. You demanded Wergild a payment of silver livestock or land. If the killer refused, you took revenge. Everyone understood the rules. It was messy, but it was a system. And sometimes those cases were incredibly precise. There are records of Icelanders arguing over how many teeth were broken in a fistfight and how much compensation each molar was worth. Historians still marvel at how detailed their legal customs were. The sagas weren't just bloodbaths. They were operating manuals for a society where murder was real, constant, and weirdly polite. You didn't just stab and flee. You stabbed, then sent someone to negotiate. But if things couldn't be settled, then came the blood feud. Generations caught in the ripple of one bad decision. Grandsons paying for their grandfather's temper. Cousins ambushing each other in meadows, quoting old insults like sacred scripture. You imagine living in that world. A place where reputation was your armor. Where a slight word could be a death sentence. Where your sheep might graze in peace today and tomorrow, your roof could burn. And yet something about it feels familiar. Not the revenge necessarily, but the community memory. The way people remember every detail, every wrong, every name. Even here in your own village, you know who's related to who hates who once said something about someone's mother 3 harvests ago. The difference is that Iceland made that social memory into law, into story, into a saga. One of the children asks if you can put a sword through a ghost. The old man laughs and says, only if you apologize afterward. You smile. You don't join in. But your thoughts are full of ash and snow and hard-faced men with long knives and long memories. And it leaves you wondering, Is it better to live with justice or to live with revenge? Back home, you pass the tanner's workshop. It's quiet now. Still, no new suspects. No answers. Just an empty stool and a skin half-cured on the rack. Another story waiting to be stitched into the village's memory. Maybe someone will write a saga about it. Or maybe they already are. It's another gray morning, the kind that makes everything feel like it's been slightly smudged. You're on the road again. Boots crunching softly over dew-soaked gravel cloak tugged tight around your shoulders. You've been asked to help deliver something to the neighboring hamlet. Something trivial. Eggs, maybe. A folded letter. A bundle of herbs. It doesn't matter. The road matters. Because medieval roads are where fear lives. No guards. No lanterns. No patrols. Just endless hedgerows, lonely woods, and that eerie stillness that always makes you glance behind. And the worst part, you don't just fear being attacked. You fear what you might find. A figure. Face down. Still. Alone. Because in a world without maps, without phones, without authority on speed dial, coming across a roadside corpse is one of the most morally confusing and socially dangerous things that can happen to you. Let's imagine you do. You turn a bend, and there it is, a man lying crumpled by the edge of the path. No cart nearby. No sound but birds. His cloak is soaked with something dark. His eyes are open. You freeze. What now? You look around instinctively. Is the killer still here? Could you be blamed? Because here's the terrible twist of the medieval mindset. If you found a body and didn't report it, you were as good as guilty. And if no one else stepped forward, you could become legally responsible for the death. The system of presentment juries required that suspicious deaths be reported immediately to local authorities, whoever passed for authority in your area. The village reeve, the bailiff, a traveling coroner if you were lucky. And if you failed to notify someone, you could be fined. Or worse. There's even a record from 1294 of a man who found a body and said nothing for a day because, quote, he had bread in the oven. He was fined heavily, and probably still lost his bread. But reporting it wasn't as simple as just saying, hey, there's a body. You'd be dragged into the investigation, maybe expected to help carry the corpse, maybe named as a witness, maybe even suspected yourself. No one wanted to find a body. And yet they were everywhere. Between plague, banditry, local feuds, and good old-fashioned accidents, the countryside was dotted with untimely deaths. Some were explained, some weren't. Some were solved by coroners' inquests, those wonderfully medieval processes where locals gathered, inspected the corpse, and tried to piece together what happened based on who hated who. Historians still argue about how detailed these inquests were. Some were surprisingly thorough, noting where the wound was, what kind of blade might have caused it, even estimating how long the victim had been dead. Others were laughably vague, found under a tree, cause unknown. You approach the imagined corpse again. Suppose you're brave enough to step closer. You notice the purse is gone. His shoes are missing. His belt has been cut. Maybe it was robbery. Or maybe those items were taken afterward by an opportunistic passerby. You'll never know. And what if you find something on the body, a letter, a coin pouch, a ring? Do you leave it? Do you pocket it? You wouldn't be the first. B. Many coroner's reports include notes about items missing from the deceased items that probably walked away in someone's cloak. You sit on a fallen log and think about what this says about your world. That death is not just feared, it's inconvenient. It's socially disruptive. It requires paperwork. Walking away is tempting but dangerous. Stepping forward is noble but risky. It's a lose-lose. And that's exactly why everyone walks a little faster past a body. You decide not to stop today because luckily there is no corpse. Not this time. Just a rotting sack someone abandoned and a shape that only looked like a person. You keep moving. You walk with purpose. You deliver your eggs. You smile at the neighbor. And on the way home, you don't look left or right too long. Because in this world, the only thing worse than finding a dead body is finding one and being the only one who knows it's there. You return from your errand just as the sky shifts from ash to peach, the kind of soft glow that tricks you into thinking the world's peaceful again. You walk a little slower, not just from tired legs, but because of the thoughts rolling around in your head. Murder on the road. In the church, in the tavern, even in the fields. But there's one setting you haven't really let yourself think about yet. Murder in the home. And not by bandits, not by strangers, but by someone who knows the way the door latch sticks, who pours the wine just right, who shares your bed. You stop briefly outside a house you've passed 100 times. Nothing odd about it, modest, clean, with a rose bush climbing up one wall. But you know the story. Everyone does. It happened years ago, but the air around it still feels heavy. They say she poisoned him, a noble woman, not of the highest tier but high enough, educated, charming, with a voice like a harp, and dresses stitched in a shade of green that no one else dared to wear. Her husband, they say, was cruel, or maybe just dull, or maybe just in the way. And then one day he died, quietly, in his chair, after a supper that only she had prepared. He turned purple, someone whispered, or pale, or nothing at all. The details change depending on who's telling it. Some say the priest defended her. Others claim he avoided the house for weeks. The servants were questioned. Nothing was proven. But everyone remembers that she left town shortly after. Remarried, some say. Disappeared, others say. And some claim she still sends letters, beautiful handwriting, never signed. Poison. It was the classic accusation for women in the medieval world. If a man murdered, it was with a sword or a stick, a brawl, a shove. But a woman always with poison. Silent, subtle, domestic. Expected. Historians still debate whether this reflects real cases or just misogyny in legal records, because it's hard to say how many women actually murdered their husbands with herbs or powders, and how many were just convenient targets when a man died mysteriously and someone needed to blame the stew. Still, the idea stuck. People feared it. In fact, the fear of poison led to laws banning women apothecaries in certain places, and to preposterous tests where food was fed to dogs first, or silver was dipped in wine to check for discoloration. Some women were tried for poisoning and confessed. Others were tortured until they said what the court wanted to hear. And a few, just a few, might have done it and gotten away with it entirely. You reach your own door and sit on the stoop. You think about the weight of that kind of suspicion. A woman who married for status or safety, or maybe even love, now cooking meals that no one wants to eat. Pouring wine she won't sip herself. Touching a teapot and wondering if everyone's watching her fingers. And what if she didn't do it? Imagine being her. A good wife, a careful one who just happened to be near when her husband took ill. He had enemies, or a weak heart, or simply bad luck. But now no one meets your eyes. No one visits. You become a ghost in your own home. You remember that noble woman's garden? The rose bush is still there, climbing, blooming inappropriately in the off-season. You wonder who planted it. Her, probably. Of course, she's not the only story. You've heard of others. A widow who remarried too quickly. A midwife who brewed her own potions. A servant who always seemed to know too much about herbs. There's a pattern, and it's not about evidence. It's about expectation. Because in a world where women were locked out of power of courts of legal ownership, the idea of a secret female killer, subtle, clever, uncatchable, was both terrifying and weirdly thrilling. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a narrative. You lean back watching the sun slip down again, thinking about how many women were feared not for what they did, but for what they might do. A knowing smile, a forgotten cup, a silence that lasted 1 second too long. And you think if someone you trusted handed you a cup of wine tonight, would you drink it? The house next door is unusually quiet. The shutters are closed even though it's still warm out, and the chickens are wandering a little too far from the yard, like no one's been around to shoo them back. You pause at the gate, not to be nosy, of course, but because you've heard the whispers. Not about a new murder. Not exactly. But about a woman who may have done one and never paid for it. She lives alone now, keeps mostly to herself. The story goes that her husband died 7 years ago. Or was it 10? Time gets slippery in these parts. Either way, he was found in the shed behind the house, slumped over the wheelbarrow, eyes wide, face gray. They said it was the heat, or bad mushrooms, or maybe he slipped and struck his head. But some people, particularly the ones who didn't like her to begin with, murmured something else. She got tired of him. No proof, of course. No bruises. No witness. No poison left behind. But that's not what really matters. Not here. What matters is that she never cried. And that's the kind of thing people notice. You walk on, but the idea follows you. Not just of her, but of women who killed and weren't caught. Or weren't punished. Or maybe weren't even guilty to begin with, but lived under the suspicion anyway. It's a strange corner of medieval history, and one scholars still puzzle over, because despite all the noise around poisonings and accusations, the actual records of women executed for murder are relatively rare. Far rarer than for men. Why? Well, some suggest women were less likely to be caught, because their methods were less direct. Poison, after all, doesn't leave a screaming match behind. It doesn't echo through the village like a dagger in the gut. It's quiet, domestic, easy to misread. Others argue that juries made up of men were reluctant to convict women, especially widows or mothers, unless the case was absolutely overwhelming. Sympathy, sexism, superstition, pick your reason. And of course, there's always the possibility that some jurors simply didn't want to know. There's even a term you've heard tossed around, usually by older villagers with dramatic flair, Black Widow. A woman who outlives more than one husband, who smiles too calmly at funerals, who seems to know a little too much about tinctures and tonics and how much of a herb is too much. She becomes a story, a warning, a way for people to make sense of tragedies they can't explain. Take Marjorie of Bridport, a real case. Her first husband died of stomach cramps. The second drowned in a shallow stream. The third simply disappeared. She said he left. The court never found a body. They couldn't prove anything, so she went free. But for the rest of her life, people crossed the street to avoid her. Even the church weighed in on the question. Some sermons warned of Eve's legacy, temptation, deception, danger. A woman's power wasn't in the sword, it was in her silence, her smile, her kitchen. And yet medieval literature is full of admiration for clever women, wily wives, lady tricksters, queens who manipulate kings into better decisions. The line between villain and heroine is thin. Sometimes it vanishes altogether. You reach the edge of the village now where the path opens onto wide fields, and you stop for a moment to watch the wind ripple through the barley. You think about justice, not the loud dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the invisible kind. Because sometimes justice isn't about law, it's about stories. And some women, fairly or not, lived in stories where they were both suspect and survivor, where guilt wasn't proven, just assumed, or denied with such poise that no one dared to press the issue further. You start back toward home, the sun slanting low behind the trees. And behind you, somewhere far off, a door creaks closed. You head home thinking you're done for the day, that maybe tonight finally your thoughts will settle, your mind will rest. But then you hear shouting. Not the panicked kind, not fear exactly, but something more formal. A crowd gathering, not large but loud, and something about the way people are standing makes you stop. You follow the noise. At the center of the square, 3 men stand on a wooden platform hastily dragged into place. They aren't soldiers exactly, but they carry weapons, and they wear the colors of a local lord, the kind of men who serve justice or at least enforce it. Whether there's a difference between the two, that depends on who's watching. In front of them, bound at the wrists, stands a man you've never seen before, clothes travel-stained, face bruised. He's accused of killing someone again, you think. But this one feels different, not because of the man, because of who has the right to kill him. You see, in the Middle Ages, not all murder was illegal. Some people had the right to kill, and others didn't. That's where things get slippery. Executioners, for instance, didn't commit murder. They carried out sentences. Soldiers killed by the dozen sometimes, for reasons that made sense only to a scribe in a distant city. Nobles might order a killing as punishment or retribution, or simply as a warning. And then there were lords who didn't need a reason at all. High justice, they called it. The authority to execute criminals, real or imagined, without a trial as you'd recognize it. It was power wrapped in ceremony, then tied with a rope. So the question isn't always, was someone killed? The question is, did the killer have permission? The man on the platform doesn't speak. The bailiff reads a charge, something about thievery, resisting arrest, striking a nobleman's man. It's vague, conveniently so. And then the sentence is read aloud. Death. No jury. No appeals. Just a nod from a man with a feather in his cap. And the executioner steps forward. You feel the shift in the crowd. Some people murmur. Others cross themselves. A few children are pulled away. No one really seems surprised. Because you all know the rule, some killings aren't murder. Not if the right person orders them. You step back from the square, not because you're afraid, but because you've seen enough. You've heard stories like this before. A merchant executed for insulting a baron's steward. A poacher hanged for killing deer that belonged to someone who'd never seen the forest. In the law books, they call it justice. In the tavern, they call it something else. Historians still argue about how legal these killings were. In some places, lords had to at least pretend to hold a trial. In others, they didn't bother. Sometimes the execution was done in public to set an example. Sometimes in private to avoid questions. But always, always, the killer walked away untouched. And that makes you think, what's the real difference between murder and execution? If both end in death, if both begin in anger or fear or ambition, maybe it's not the act that matters. Maybe it's the uniform. You pass a soldier on the way home leaning against a wall, scratching his chin with a knife that's definitely seen use. He smiles at you. Too wide. Too tired. You nod politely and don't stop walking. Because in this world, the blade is innocent as long as it's held by the right hand. The next morning arrives quietly. The kind of calm that feels borrowed, as if the wind and sky made a private agreement to behave just for a day. You take a slow walk past the chapel again, past the place where that man was hanged yesterday. Nothing left now but footprints in the dust and the faint smell of old rope. But people aren't talking about him anymore. They're talking about the one who got away. Because sometimes the killer doesn't run. He walks, calmly, across the village, right into the church. And once he crosses the threshold, you can't touch him. Not if he claims sanctuary. It sounds made up, but it was very real. Sanctuary was a medieval legal concept and a spiritual one that gave accused criminals the right to seek temporary protection in a church. You kill a man. You flee to the nearest holy place, you grab hold of the altar or the door ring or the sanctuary knocker, and for a time you're safe. Not forever, usually 40 days, but that time gave you options: confess, negotiate exile, or arrange compensation. It was a pause button on vengeance. Today, a boy saw someone duck into the priory chapel and swear an oath before the altar. Blood on his boots, no explanation. And now the villagers stand just outside the gate debating, is he guilty? Is he clever? Is he afraid? Sanctuary was supposed to protect the soul, not the crime. But that distinction blurred quickly. People used it for all sorts of reasons: guilt, innocence, desperation, strategy. Some fled real punishment. Some fled false accusation. And some historians suggest used sanctuary as a kind of legal limbo, a place to buy time or hope or silence. Sanctuaries existed across England and Europe. Some churches even had sanctuary knockers, large iron door rings you could grab as a kind of divine panic button. Others simply required that you reach the altar and declare your need. Once inside, the church had to protect you. The law agreed. Even kings couldn't break that rule, at least not openly. But there were ways around it. Some lords would starve the fugitive out. Others would surround the church with guards and wait. Occasionally, someone would slip a coin to a priest to forget to lock the door that night. And every now and then, someone would just ignore the rule completely. Break in. Drag the accused out. Consequences be damned. There's a famous case from 1201 when a thief named John of Nottingham claimed sanctuary in a London church. The townspeople, furious, broke in, pulled him out, and killed him in the street. The church excommunicated dozens. The town paid fines. But the message was clear: sanctuary wasn't always respected. You reach the chapel gate yourself, peer inside. You can't see anyone, but you know he's in there, sitting quietly, waiting, praying maybe, or planning. You wonder what he did or if he did anything at all. Because here's the thing: once someone claims sanctuary, the village stops being a place of judgment. It becomes a place of suspense. And fear has a hard time waiting quietly. Some people say sanctuary was a beautiful thing, a chance for mercy in a brutal world. Others say it was a loophole, a place where guilty men could sit on holy ground and stall justice with a well-timed prayer. Historians still argue about its effectiveness. Some say it prevented bloodshed. Others say it merely delayed it. Some suggest it offered the illusion of fairness, when in truth it only worked for the fast and the fortunate. You head home wondering what would happen if someone you loved were murdered and the killer sat comfortably inside the church, untouchable, untouched. Would you wait 40 days, or would you push open the door? The next week passes with no new deaths, no fresh blood, no mysterious screams in the night. By medieval standards, that's a luxury. You wake, stretch, listen to the geese argue with each other, and for the first time in a while you think maybe things are settling. But peace is a funny thing. In this world, it never means silence. It means something else is taking up the noise. And lately that noise is rumor. You're back at the well drawing water when you hear it again. A boy in the next village was found dead near the hedgerow. Everyone says it was murder, except it wasn't. No wounds, no witnesses. Just a boy lying in the grass, eyes open, mouth slack. The priest called it a fever. His mother said he was cursed. And a few people, just a few, say they saw someone running into the woods that night. Someone who doesn't exist. Because sometimes in the Middle Ages, a murder doesn't need a murderer. What it needs is a story. You know this game. It starts small, a suspicion, a memory, a whisper. Then it grows. Someone remembers seeing a stranger. Someone else recalls a shadow. And before long, there's a whole tale spun from nothing more than fear and familiarity. Rumor becomes evidence. The village decides, and the accused. They may not even know they've been accused. There's a woman in your village, quiet, limp, slightly, wears her hair covered, keeps to herself. People say she once lived in a plague village. People say she speaks to birds. People say she knew the boy. People say a lot. And here's the terrible truth: some medieval murders never happened at all. But the aftermath, that was real. People were punished for imagined crimes, executed for deaths that turned out to be illness or accident or invention. A man once hanged for allegedly poisoning his lord until the lord's dog died too, and it turned out they'd both eaten moldy rye. A woman in York was burned for witching a baby to death. Later, the midwife admitted the child had been stillborn. Historians still debate how much of this was panic versus deliberate manipulation. In some cases, rumor was used as a weapon, land disputes disguised as murder accusations, romantic jealousy spun into ghost stories. But often, it was simple fear. The world was confusing, cruel, and fast. People needed answers. And when the facts didn't provide them, the imagination did. Back home, you sit by the hearth and think about all the things you think you've seen. The man in the red cloak who passed through last market day. The dog that barked at nothing. The way that widow clutches her rosary just a bit too tight. You don't believe in witches. Probably. You don't believe in ghosts. Probably. But what if someone else does? What if enough people believe? And what happens when belief turns into blame? Because in the medieval mind, fear creates reality, and a murder that lives only in rumor can still send someone to the gallows. You finish your stew, scrape the bowl clean, and place it gently on the shelf. Then you blow out the candle. Not because you're tired, but because you don't want to see your own shadow whispering back at you. You're woken in the night not by footsteps or bells, but by something stranger, silence. Too deep, too wide, like the whole village is holding its breath. And then you remember the plague has returned. It's not in your house yet, not in your family, but it's nearby. Someone collapsed in the fields yesterday, coughing blood. A girl fainted at market. A priest left a sermon halfway through, pale as a candle. People are starting to leave, to lock doors, to stop making eye contact. And that's when it starts. The blaming. You've seen it before or heard about it anyway. 1348. The Great Death. Bodies stacked like firewood wagons creaking down the road, the stench of fear thicker than the disease itself. And when people couldn't explain it, they pointed fingers. Because if murder is terrifying, mass murder is worse. Especially when it comes wrapped in cloth, coughing through cities, dropping neighbors overnight. And in medieval Europe, the line between plague and punishment blurred quickly. It happened in Strasbourg, and Basel, and dozens of other cities across France and the Holy Roman Empire. As the Black Death swept in, people whispered about poisoned wells, spells, secrets, a plan. And the target of that fear, the Jews. Thousands were murdered not by plague, but by people. Entire communities burned, families dragged from homes, children thrown into rivers. The plague had made everyone sick, but fear made them cruel. You remember what you've been told, that in some places Jews were tortured until they confessed to causing the plague with powders and poison. That no one asked how the disease also killed Jews. That logic drowned in fire. It wasn't just them either. Lepers were blamed. So were outsiders, strangers, even women who brewed their own remedies. Anyone different enough to fear. Anyone weak enough not to fight back. And the worst part? It felt like justice to the people who did it. They weren't murdering, they were cleansing, protecting, acting on what they'd heard, on what the priest said, on what everyone knows. Historians still debate how coordinated the pogroms were. Some claim local authorities tried to intervene. Others say those same authorities gave the quiet nod that let the flames rise. But for the victims, it didn't matter. Their names weren't remembered. Their stories mostly lost. What remained was the silence, the ash, the fact that fear left unchecked had turned into mob murder. And that's why tonight, as you sit in your quiet cottage, hands clasped tight, you feel something worse than dread. You feel recognition. Because fear hasn't changed. It still stalks people in the dark. Still whispers that someone else must be to blame. Still gathers in groups of 10, then 50, then 100. Until a name becomes a sentence, and a sentence becomes a funeral. You check your shutters again. Not for plague, for people. Because when disease spreads, the body trembles. But when paranoia spreads, it kills. The plague hasn't reached your cottage yet, but you can feel it out there like a wolf beyond the tree line, close enough to hear, not close enough to see. People are still going about their business, but quieter now. Fewer stalls at the market. Fewer children playing in the road. Everyone walks like they're trying not to make a sound that might attract death. It would help maybe to feel watched over. To know someone was keeping the peace, guarding the village gates, making sure fear didn't get too sharp. But as you look around, you realize what every medieval villager eventually does. The night watch doesn't watch. Oh sure, there are men who carry lanterns and wear hoods. Men who patrol in theory. But in practice, most of them are asleep, or drunk, or conveniently looking the other way when a cart rolls by in the dark. The town watch, or nightward as it was often called, was less a force of order and more a collection of warm bodies doing their best not to be noticed. Many were just local men pressed into service on a rotating basis. Not professionals, not trained, just tired. And when something truly dangerous happened, they raised the hue and cry, then hoped someone else would deal with it. You pass one now curled on a stool near the gatehouse, chin on chest breath rattling through his nose. His lantern has gone out. The pike at his side leans more than he does. You think about shaking him awake. But what's the point? Historians still argue about how effective these night watches were. Some towns had decent ones paid armed, mildly alert. But in most places, especially small villages, the watch was symbolic, like hanging garlic on a door to keep evil spirits out. Reassuring in concept, useless in crisis. That's why people locked their own doors, kept dogs, whispered warnings to their children, because they knew that if something happened in the night, they'd be the first to face it and the last to get help. In some cities, watchmen carried horns to blow if they saw trouble, fires, thieves, murder. But imagine relying on a man half asleep in a robe fumbling for his horn while someone screams 2 houses over. The truth is, the night belonged to itself. That's why even decent folk sometimes did bad things after sunset. A grudge, a bit too much ale, a quiet lane with no witnesses. Darkness has always had a way of softening consequences, and criminals knew this. Some moved only at night, not because they were afraid of being seen, but because they knew they wouldn't be. The cover of darkness was more reliable than any bribe. There's a story from 1383 London. A man was stabbed in a back alley, a dozen houses nearby. Doors locked. No one answered. The watch came 4 hours later, scribbled a note on a bit of parchment and shuffled away. The killer was never caught. Back home, you light your own candle. Your shutters are closed, your door is barred. Not out of habit, but out of understanding. You know what everyone in this village knows deep down, that the people meant to keep you safe probably won't. So you rely on something else. On the old routines. The latch checked 3 times. The knife near the bed. The silent prayer muttered under your breath, not to any saint in particular, but to the idea that maybe, just maybe, tonight won't be the night someone tries your door. You blow out the candle and listen to the silence, to the creak of old timber, to the absence of footsteps. Because sometimes the scariest thing of all is knowing no one is watching. Morning, again. You're alive, again. That shouldn't feel like an achievement, but lately it does. You stretch stiff limbs, shake the dust from your cloak, and step out into the pale daylight. There's a crispness to the air, something that whispers, for now all is quiet. But as you walk through the village, your steps slow, not because of fear, but because of math. Specifically, your life has a price. You pass a wooden board nailed to the church wall, a proclamation inked in bold, uneven strokes. It's about compensation, about weregild, literally man price. The fine someone must pay for taking a life. And it's a reminder that in the medieval world, murder wasn't always punished with the rope. Sometimes it was settled with coins. You pause to read, "A free man shall pay 120 shillings for the life of a noble. A lesser man, 60. A serf, 20. A woman, half her husband's worth." Charming. The weregild system came from Germanic tradition and held sway in many regions before more centralized laws took over. It wasn't about guilt, it was about value. You killed someone, you paid their family, not because they were grieving, but because you'd taken property. Let that sink in. You were property. You personally are probably worth about 40 shillings. Less if you're elderly, less if you're unmarried, even less if you're sick. If you're a woman, maybe 20. Unless you're pregnant, then it's a bit more, but not much. There's even a price list in some old laws for body parts. Fingers, eyes, teeth. As if you were a cow being tallied for market. Historians still argue how strictly these prices were enforced. In practice, the wealthy often paid to avoid trial. The poor often couldn't pay at all, and so were punished more harshly. Sometimes blood money bought peace. Other times it just started another feud as someone demanded more than coins could ever give. You pass a woman at her doorway, sweeping. Her son was killed 2 years ago in a tavern brawl. The man responsible offered 3 goats, 2 sacks of flour, and a promise never to come back. She accepted. But she doesn't smile anymore. Not everyone accepted compensation, of course. Some insisted on execution. But many took the coins not out of forgiveness, but out of survival. A dead husband meant no income. A dead son meant no labor. Vengeance was expensive. Coin could feed you. And so people learned to put a number on loss, on grief, on blood. You try to imagine how your family would calculate your worth. Would they ask for 60 shillings? Would someone haggle them down to 40? Would your name be carved in the chapel wall or forgotten because your death came with a receipt? It's horrifying, but also oddly practical. Because in a world where death came quickly and often measuring, it was a way to manage it. You keep walking, thinking about how we still do this. Not with shillings, but with settlements, insurance, value assessed in courtrooms and paperwork. The illusion that justice can be calculated. You round the bend back toward home, passing the spot where the Reeve was buried. His killer paid 12 sheep, 3 casks of ale, and gave up half his land. It was enough. Barely. But people still spit when they walk by his widow. Because money doesn't clean the blood. It just pays to forget it. Today the sun comes up warm, but something about the way the light hits the stone walls makes everything feel colder. Not physically, just emotionally. It's that kind of day. You walk to the well, to the bakery, to the place where people gather. But fewer people are talking. Fewer are looking up. You realize you haven't laughed in a while. Neither has anyone else. It's not that someone has died. It's that anyone could. And you've started looking at everyone just a little differently. Because you know now the killer could be your neighbor. The boy who fixes your thatch. The girl who sells carrots. The man who brings in firewood and whistles tunelessly. They all seem a little more distant these days. And that's the last and deepest layer of the fear of murder in the medieval world. Not the blood, not the punishment, not the ghost or the knife. It's the slow erosion of trust. You've lived here your whole life. You know these people. But now you wonder who might be holding a grudge. Who watched too closely when the coroner arrived. Who offered to help a little too quickly. This is the creeping dread that seeps in after the stories have been told. The bodies buried, the coins paid, the suspects forgotten. It's the silence of a village where everyone has secrets. There's the smith, always angry. The miller who drinks too much and talks too little. The old woman whose husband died years ago under confusing circumstances. The boy who hasn't spoken since he saw the man hanged in the square. The truth is, most murderers in the medieval world weren't strangers. They were friends, neighbors, family. That's what made it terrifying. You'd eat beside them, work beside them, laugh with them. And then one day, someone didn't wake up. Inquests often revealed as much. The victim was usually known to the accused. There were feuds, debts, unspoken tensions. Even sharing a field could be dangerous. A fence placed too far. A cow that trampled grain. One bad harvest and a friend became a suspect. Historians still debate how often these killings were planned versus spontaneous. Was it rage or slow-building hate or just opportunity? We may never know, but one thing is certain: violence bred silence. You start to see the signs. The way people pause before speaking. The way they say, "terrible business," but won't look you in the eye. The way they move a little faster after sunset. You sit at your window as the sky begins to blush. A woman walks by with her child, glancing nervously at the chapel. A man crosses the square without speaking. A dog barks at nothing, then stops tail down. Everyone's being careful, because in a place where justice is shaky and law is slow and ghosts never really leave, the only real defense is not to stand out. That's why you keep your voice soft, your knife clean, your opinions measured. Because the murderer could be anyone. And if you push too hard, ask too much, accuse the wrong person, you could be next. So you blow out your candle. You bar the door. You murmur a prayer. Not because you're afraid of the dark, but because you know who lives in it. You've made it through another night. And that in the medieval world is no small victory. You stretch your arms and crack your neck, listening for the creak of old floorboards and the distant clatter of hooves on stone. Morning comes with its usual burdens, chores, gossip bread that never quite rises, but something about today feels different. Maybe it's because you understand now. Not just the danger, but the shape of it. The way it presses into the corners of your life. The way it hums beneath the surface of your village. Murder isn't just an event here, it's a possibility. A presence. A whispered name. And yet life doesn't stop. It just adapts. The streets are a little quieter, yes. The glances a little longer. The shutters close earlier. But the market still bustles. The church bell still tolls. The world continues despite everything. That's the real legacy of fear, not paralysis. Routine. You go through the day like everyone else. You help mend a fence, share a crust of bread, listen to a woman complain about her husband's snoring as if she didn't once accuse him of stealing a chicken. These are the rituals, not grand gestures but survival in the small things. You pass the place where the last killing happened, a patch of weeds growing now, where blood once pooled. The children avoid it, not out of superstition, but because adults talk when they walk by. And children even now know how to steer clear of things that make grown-ups talk in half sentences. You remember the body. You remember the questions. You remember the silence afterward, the long, awkward dinners, the hurried masses, the closed doors. And then you remember that fear doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it shows up as caution, as quiet. You think about all the ways the fear of murder has shaped your village. You've seen justice handed out with coins and with rope. You've watched people confess to things they didn't do. You've watched others walk away from things everyone knew they did. You've seen the law bend to the rich. You've seen vengeance dressed up as justice. And still every morning someone opens the bakery. Someone mends a roof. Someone kneels to pray. Because even in a world where death can come from a shadow or a friend's hand or the wrong kind of stew, you have to keep living. And that really is the most medieval thing of all. You step inside your home. The shutters creak closed. The candle flickers. The village hums softly beyond your door. Maybe tomorrow someone will die. Maybe not. But tonight your knife is sharp. Your prayers are said. And your door is locked. Because in this world, the fear of murder is not about monsters or madness. It's about being ready. Always ready. Just in case. The candle burns lower. Your breathing evens out, and the sharp edges of the day begin to soften. You've walked dark roads. You've heard whispers in the chapel. You've stood in the dust of the gallows and watched shadows move just beyond the firelight. But now all of that begins to fade. Let it go. The footsteps were only the wind. The creak of the floorboard, only the house settling. The faces in the crowd. Just tired people, like you, trying to make sense of a world that so often refused to make sense. Let your muscles relax. Let your jaw unclench. You've made it through the fear, through the ritual, through the long, uncertain nights. And though danger may never truly disappear, it can be quieted. Like this, tonight, you are not running, not watching, not wondering who to trust. Tonight, you rest. Because even in the most uncertain world, even in one where murder might wait behind a smile or a wooden door, you've earned peace. Just for a little while. So let the past drift into silence. Let the stories fold themselves back into the shadows. Let the final candle go out. You are safe. You are still. And the night is over.